Welcome to Scoolinary, the online cooking school that transforms people and connects cultures. You will learn with the best chefs in the industry, and you will discover the broadest online catalog of topics related to gastronomy. We publish new courses every week. In our podcast, we have coffee with a chef every week. Each of them will tell us about their experience and their vision for the culinary world to help you better understand this exciting industry. Come on, join us for coffee. Today, we are joined by Sammy Monsour, Michelin award-winning chef who's become a certain kind of champion celebrity for his tireless activism in sustainable sourcing. He seems to be involved in a dizzying number of initiatives that are underscored by a mission to promote sustainability in many forms. He is the author of 2 cookbooks, American Burger Revival and Salt and Shore, which is due out in June. His Scoolinary course, Southern Cuisine, is as loyal to its roots as Sammy is dedicated to its authenticity. Hi, Sammy. Welcome, and thanks for joining us for coffee.
Hey, well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, but I'm on a metabolism reset diet and I haven't had a cup of coffee in 23 days.
Oh, well, so what are you drinking these days?
Water.
Okay. Well, we'll sit tight. It's only 5 days more. So,
I know I
good
threw a
luck. You can
curveball
make it.
your
You've
way,
made it
but
this
I was
far.
thinking about it. Yeah.
So, you know what? If you would please tell us in your own words who you are and where you're from, and that's so that our listeners have a chance to get to know you a little bit better.
Sure. I'm a chef and I grew up in North Carolina, working at my parents' restaurant. Really just fell in love with the kitchen, the atmosphere, the intensity, the fun that was being had, the act of cooking. Um, and I've just loved food and, eating my whole life. So that just got me into, cooking professionally as an adult. Went to culinary school. I've worked in New York, Boston. I have a restaurant in LA, but I also currently have a home in Charleston, South Carolina, where I am right now.
Yeah, and there's a really rich dining culture there as well.
There is. It's
Yeah.
why I want to be here. My wife is my business partner at the restaurant, Joyce, in downtown LA. She's my co-author. We do everything together. And she's also from South Carolina. Her name is Cassidy. And so, as a couple of Carolina people who met in LA, it was pretty amazing for us to get to start a home in Charleston because to us, it's the most iconic Southern food city in the Southeast. And I
Sure.
say that because in the Gulf Coast, you've got New Orleans.
Ah, that's right. Right. So, as I mentioned in the intro, your activism is becoming really legendary. So, happy day after Earth Day. What did you do yesterday?
Well, I did in terms of activism, I did a sustainability video for Chef's Manifesto as part of a much bigger series of videos. A lot of chefs contributed a 15-second one-liner in terms of something that we can do or implement to ensure that the hospitality industry is thinking forward in terms of sustainability for future generations. How do we
Oh,
preserve the hospitality industry? That was cool. And then I also did like a sustainability giveaway with a company called Chef Works.
oh, cool.
But really, what I did was I just hung out with my family and, cooked dinner and just had a nice Monday.
Nice. So, if listeners want to see that video through Chef's Manifesto, where would they go?
They would check it out on Instagram.
Ah, okay. So, let's go back a little bit into your history. You almost quite literally grew up in the kitchen when you started washing dishes at age 12 in your parents' restaurant. And then you eventually worked up to lead line cook by the time you were 18. What was the first dish you remember cooking?
I don't think I remember a dish per se, but it was just that the a big moment for me was when I got trained on the grill
Mhm.
because and maybe I was like 15 or 16 and that was like a real station. And before that I was working on like the cold station like garde manger, and a lot of the stuff I was doing was like prepping vegetables, and then, like, just providing, like, vegetable sets and cold salads, etcetera, and I wasn't intimidated by that, but I was intimidated by, like, cooking meats and, like, finishing the entrees and, like, in the dishes and putting them on the plates, and I just remember this moment when I one of the head cooks in my dad's restaurant kitchen was like, "Hey, man, it's not that busy tonight. Let's get you trained up on this." And I was, like, nervous, and then, like, halfway through service, I was like, "I'm doing it." And that was just really cool.
Yeah, and so what style of restaurant was this?
It was just an American bar and grill neighborhood restaurant in a shopping plaza in Chapel Hill, next to a movie theater and a grocery store, and it was just good, straightforward American eats, lots of sandwiches, like great sandwiches though,
Hmm,
like hot sandwiches, and then like classic dishes like a crawfish etouffee, red beans and rice, jambalaya. Actually, more my dad had a big knack for New Orleans cuisine, and so it was more like New Orleans style food than it was Southeastern North Carolinian food.
huh,
Although, we
okay,
did do the pulled pork, which is
sure.
pretty famous in North Carolina.
Can a restaurant, authentic North Carolina restaurant, exist without doing pulled pork?
Probably if it's vegan.
Ah, huh, yeah, true.
But yeah, it was just cool, it's like it's grounded food, it's what I love to cook and eat, and it's kind of how I've just tried to make sure that no matter what I've done or where I've gone with my food, I don't take it past that place of, being rooted in the authenticity of the dishes and what the food is, if that
Ah,
makes sense.
that does make sense, and I wanted to see if you could expound a little bit more about that, specifically with, relation to the food that you cook. How did your cooking evolve from there?
In a complicated way, like most chef's journeys, I went to culinary school with the CIA in Hyde Park, and I was on campus there for 4 years because I did the bachelor's program after my culinary arts degree. And then I continued working with a catering company that I was employed with during school for 2 more years. And then I was like, all right, I got to get out of here. I traveled around the country for about 2 years, staging. I mean, I went all over, staying with friends from culinary school, staging in places, and then I ended up in Boston in 2008 and was like, "This place is awesome. This is where I wanna be." So, I think I was collecting ideas that whole time, and then when I stuck in Boston, my goal was to open up a restaurant, and that took about 2.5 years to make happen, and in the meantime, I was just learning what the scene was and who the chefs were and eating around and really getting in like, falling in love with the food in Boston and the style of cooking that's, like, so rustic, and it's delicious, and it's complicated, and it's plated up, and it's really amazing food, and, like, I was able to after we opened up, the first restaurant I ever opened up, which was just a gastro pub called JM Curly, and we were doing cool food, but, like, it became the spot where chefs went after they got out of work, and so all these people that I was, like, eating, and looking up to, they became my friends, and then I was doing dinners with them, and I was learning from them, and it was very impressionable on me because it was almost like culinary school 2.0.
Yeah,
And then we started flying in chefs from around the country to do dinners with us, like Dominique Crenn, out of San Francisco, and Jeremy
sure.
Fox out of LA, and I mean, the list just keeps going on, and I'm making, like, friends with these folks that, like, we're still friends to this day. It's this big network and it continues to expand. But, it was very impressionable on me and it made me realize that I didn't know what my food was yet, even though I'd opened up my first restaurant and I knew what my food was. So I started experimenting. I went down the molecular gastronomy rabbit hole, really,
Mhm.
really learning about hydrocolloids, but applying them to my food, and I started this series called The Future of Junk Food, where I was basically recreating iconic junk food with local in season, sustainably sourced ingredients. And the only, the thing is, the way I saw it when I learned about molecular gastronomy, reading modernist cuisine, understanding hydrocolloids was like, wow, these are all the ingredients and techniques that are used in processed foods. And they create
Huh.
texture and they create flavor sensations and they also create visual appearance. And so what if I was to use these ingredients and my understanding to recreate that, but with good ingredients? And that was a lot of fun. And after I got that out of my bones, I think I kind of, you're getting older, you're maturing, and you're like, okay, I don't want food. Eventually, I realized I don't want my food to be like, my food doesn't have to be a message. I can work on that outside of the kitchen. I just want my food to be like a charming, soulful experience that people can really just enjoy. And I think that there's a thing I bring up in the Scoolinary course where I say, we got a bib gourmand for our Southern food. And I think that's ideal for me. I wouldn't want to try to get a star with Southern food because it starts to become too removed from its roots.
Yeah.
uh, I think when you start to get into the stars, earning stars of Michelin, you're heightening the experience a little past the dinner table and more into an experiential service gets involved. And it's beautiful, but to me, and this is just me speaking, that's not what Southern food is because Southern food is very centered around family and togetherness and home cooking.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I was going to ask you about a comment that you made, I think, in my research about Southern hospitality. It seems very distinct because you mentioned it a few times. And for people who don't live in the South who might not understand that, could you define that in a sentence or two?
I'll give it a shot. I think that Southern hospitality is just it is authentic, it is unwavering, it is outgoing, and it is treating everybody with the same amount of welcomeness and enthusiasm and as if they were family from the moment they come through your door.
Hmm. And it sounds like from very early on when you arrived in Boston, I mean, chefs were paying you kind of the highest compliment without saying anything at all by showing up at your restaurant. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that was probably one of the coolest things that to this date that ever happened to me, you know?
Yeah.
It was a huge honor again, and it allowed me to learn from these great chefs, like, in a way that I never could have dreamed of.
Yeah. So in your culinary journey, both when you were traveling around staging and also when you landed in Boston, was there any specific point that started to change your mind about how you viewed food?
Yeah, I think that it was after a year of being open at JM Curly. We were wildly popular. We were busy. I would change my menus every Tuesday, and I did that for years. And every Tuesday, we would have a line down the block of people that wanted to come in. It caught on, and people wanted to see what I was doing next. And I would always have a theme, and I think that's what was fun for people. There would be a concept to the menu. Like, big ones were like, 25th anniversary of Wu-Tang Clan menu. This was like 2000,
Nice.
like people love stuff like that, and so do I. Or we did like a goodbye Breaking Bad when it was like the Breaking Bad last episode, and so all the fans of that show are coming out, and we're making food inspired by the series. And so we were very busy, and it was very hard, and we got a lot of accolade and celebration. And a year into it, I was like, man, okay, like I don't even remember how old I was at this point, maybe 28. I was like, okay, so like this is really hard, and this is what becoming an executive chef and opening up my own place looks like, which was like my lifelong dream. And that's a very young age to achieve that, but I'd been like on that track for 15 years, so it felt like, it was well earned. And I was just like, so what's gonna keep me in this for like 40 more years? And around that time, I got invited to participate in a Stop the Pebble Mine in Bristol Bay, like, campaign by Chefs Collaborative, which is a national nonprofit organization started by and led by chefs. At the time, they were headquartered out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, right across the river from Boston. And so I was like, "Hey, what's this about? This is interesting." And it was for, I think it was for Earth Day too, if
Oh,
memory serves me correct. And it was just like, "Hey, source wild caught Alaskan sockeye salmon, put it on your menu, and use that as an activation to talk about the Pebble Mine and that we need to stop it." And I participated in that campaign, and that obviously, while doing so, learned a lot about that, and I'd never heard of the Pebble Mine, I didn't know about any of this, and I think this was when it was first starting to come on the scene in the first place, 'cause they're still actively trying to do this, but
so
we got a victory, and I was like, "Oh," like a light bulb went off, and I was like, this is what's gonna keep me in it," like, and so I started to go down the rabbit hole of sustainability.
can you explain to us what pebble mining is?
Sure. So it's just mining, but the Pebble Mine specifically, it's called the Pebble Mine, is a
Ah,
proposed mining operation in the Bristol Bay region of Alaska, to extract precious metals like gold, silver, and palladium. And, I think there's other non-precious metals in there, definitely copper. But essentially, there is an abundant natural resource of these metals in that watershed, and the Pebble Mine wants to get them. But unfortunately, what would happen would be that it would decimate another natural resource, that being the sockeye salmon. It
okay.
would completely destroy their habitat,
Mhm,
and that's like it's the largest run of wild salmon in the world. So you have this beautiful, healthy, living, precious resource, which is the salmon, that, some people wouldn't have an issue with basically taking their home away and
mm.
crippling their existence to get these metals. And that's just kinda like environmental activism 101. Wait, wow, people are willing to, like, destroy the earth and life on earth to get, dollars?
Right. Thank you for that explanation. That was super helpful. So, since then, you've lobbied, written, spoken, and you've taught courses focused on sustainable cooking, which listeners can learn more about on your website, chefsammymonsour.com. What are you working on these days?
So I'm working with the Environmental Defense Fund, the EDF. I've been working with them for 2.5 years on sustainable food system policy in the arena of aquaculture. We formed a coalition called the Coalition for Sustainable Aquaculture. And then while doing that, I put together a team of 25 chefs that I lead, and we just focus on using our voices to try to influence policy, specifically the Seafood Act. Our policy team at the EDF been working with representatives of Congress to get this on the floor and get some traction. The Seafood Act is, man, I'm not great with always remembering acronyms, but it is an acronym. It's like sustainable and equitable. I'm gonna look it up.
Okay. We can put it in the show notes as well.
Yeah, sorry. You know what? It's the Science-Based Equitable Aquaculture Food Act. And basically, what we're trying to do is launch an offshore aquaculture industry in federal waters that
Hmm.
is done with science first, starting out slowly with pilot programs funded by the government, making sure we do everything sustainably. Also, there's a big social equity piece, making sure that the communities and the people of the coastlines, along with underserved populations, all have access to be able to be a part of this, because it would be a huge new industry. Like, currently we don't really do offshore net pen aquaculture in this
Oh.
country.
Huh. So, just to clear something up, I was curious about aqua farmed oysters, which are regarded as a sustainable seafood, whereas aqua farmed salmon, for example, is just the opposite. I was wondering if you could
Mhm.
educate us on the different farming methods of each seafood.
Sure. So I think there's near shore and then there's offshore if you're talking about saltwater, and then there's freshwater. So Freshwater aquaculture could be anything from trout to, there's some really good trout farms in the US. Crawfish, pond raised crawfish in Louisiana is very sustainable. I know that up in the Pacific Northwest, there's freshwater Arctic char. So there are some fin fish and some shellfish being done in that method. Then the near shore stuff is going to be things like seaweeds, right? Sea
Mhm.
plants, because seafood is also plants. So you'll have your sea plants and your a lot of shellfish, specifically mollusks like oysters, clams, and mussels. And with oysters, clams, and mussels, there's no feed involved. They're just planting them as seedlings and they grow. And so it's thought of as sustainable. Well, it's sustainable in general just because like one oyster or clam can filter 50 gallons of ocean water a day, right? So they're like
Oh,
actually cleaning the environment as they grow. And because it's near shore, it doesn't really have an impact on wildlife. These things don't escape. I guess I would just to roll into the complex issues of offshore net pen aquaculture, it can be sustainable and it can be unsustainable, just
huh.
like farming onions or potatoes, right?
Sure, sure.
So with offshore net pen aquaculture, you have these pens, these net pens of finfish, and there's a whole series of criterion that could or could not be met. One is the feed bill. What are you feeding them and what's it made of? There's a fish in to fish out ratio. Poor practices would be that it could take 10 pounds of wild caught pelagic fish
Mhm.
to produce enough food to grow 1 pound of farm raised fish. So that's not using resources effectively, right? But there's sustainable feed where 1 pound of wild caught fish can grow 3 pounds of fish.
Huh.
And that's better than in the wild.
Wow.
So, and those feeds are achieved through supplementing, using less wild caught fish and fish oils in those meals and supplementing with omega rich algae meals, which is, on the cusp of innovation in science.
Hmm.
Another thing that people are concerned about is escape. If you were to get, let's say a shark comes up to this net pen and rips it open and a million salmon escape into the wild. Because
Huh.
they're farm raised, there could be a series of events that could happen that could have a negative impact on the evolution of the wild species if the farm raised salmon and the wild salmon were to mate, because fish have their own GPS.
Huh.
For example, like salmon, they'll travel the world, some of these salmon, but they go back to the place they were born to spawn.
Right.
And so, like, when there's the big salmon runs in the Pacific Northwest, when these like hundreds of millions of salmon are coming back through that watershed to Bristol Bay, let's say, to spawn, that's because they were born there, and so within them is this natural GPS to go back there. But so, what would happen if you took a farm raised salmon that was born in a hatchery and they bred with salmon from the wild? Well, those salmon don't have that GPS because they weren't born in a watershed. So how could that impact? So it starts to get very complex. This is just two of maybe six. I think that helps illustrate it, but there's probably like 6 or 7 big things out there with farming seafood out
Mhm.
in the offshore waters. And I will say this though, in the fjords of Norway, there's a lot of science and innovation and money involved in doing it sustainably. It's going to be hard for you to get your hands on Norwegian farm raised salmon and find it to be unsustainable. But
Huh.
there's other countries in the world, maybe in South America, that might not have the same resources and might be doing it unsustainably. I've been to sustainable salmon farms in Chile, though, so you can't count that out. It just starts to get complex. You have to know what outfit is behind this and what are their practices.
Is in the case of the Norwegian salmon, is that a government intervention to regulate salmon farming to make it more sustainable, or is it voluntary?
Probably both. The governments in any country regulate, right? They'll set the benchmark. And I do believe in a country like Norway where it is a small country with a small population that might produce more salmon than any other country in the world.
Hmm.
I'd have to fact check that. It's a huge industry and it's a huge way of life. And they're also, just as a culture, very connected with their little spot on earth. And they have a lot of money, like because of with the salmon industry in Norway has a lot of money, and they pride themselves on how clean the fjord is and preserving that.
Yeah.
And they use that money to advance the technology. And that's really where, I mean, because the technology is what allows the science to work. I mean, I've seen camera systems in the fjords of Norway, whereas like as soon as that fish feed falls below a certain level, they stop sending it out because it says, okay, the fish aren't eating this anymore. It's sinking too far down.
Hmm.
Their barges are powered on Tesla battery cells. Their processing plants are within a stone's throw, and they're state of the art. There's no waste involved. It's really amazing. I think that in terms of aquaculture in general in our country, we have been told this story. Maybe it started 20 years ago about how unsustainable, and I'm sorry, in the US, when I say
Hmm.
our country, in
Yep.
the US, we were told how unsustainable aquaculture is, farming fish is, and that narrative is stuck. And 20 years ago, it was a lot more unsustainable than it is today. But like 20 years ago, we didn't have smartphones. Lots changed in 20 years.
Sure.
In modern, although people have been farming fish for 10,000 years, the concept of modern aquaculture as we know it today started in the 70s. So this is
Hmm.
a fairly new industry. So when there was a lot of negative press coming out in the early 2000s, it was about 35 years in, and there's just been huge advancements on a global level.
Yeah, in just 20 years.
Yeah.
So let's get into your cookbooks. You've written one with your wife Cassidy, that's called Salt and Shore, and it's coming out, as I said in the intro, it's coming out in June. Now, the book seems to be an invitation to explore Southern seafood cooking in a conscientious way through recipes and personal narratives meant to heighten our awareness of Southern cooking, hospitality, and culture. I was wondering if you could give us a little preview of the book.
Sure. In terms of what? What do you want me to preview?
Well, I'd like to know a little bit about the recipes. Like, pick one. Just say,
Oh, sure.
yeah, a recipe, and then maybe where the personal narrative intersects with the book.
Absolutely. The first chapter is libations, which are beverages, which is one of my wife Cassidy's specialties. So the next chapter becomes our first food chapter, and that is called Ice Cold. And that is basically me as a professional chef trying to break down the stigma and intimidation involved in raw seafood preparations, whether it's shucking oysters or making a crudo or a ceviche, because although there is technique and precision involved, it doesn't need to be intimidating. And I think that's one of those styles of preparation that most people don't try at home.
Hmm.
And I think they should because it's delicious. And it's actually pretty easy. There's no cooking involved.
There you
So
go. That's a convincing argument right there. Wait, you mean I don't have to cook? Hey, now.
yeah, you just have to, use the right techniques. And so what we're doing in that chapter is trying to go over is the recipes are specific to the actual dish, but they're also trying to teach you an overarching technique that if I were to give you a crudo recipe, you can make this crudo, but that you should be able to understand the principles of how to make crudo in general if you'd
Okay,
like to
so
try to venture out.
so maybe I should open up our minds and ask you, what's your favorite Southern ingredient or technique?
Ooh, right now. I can say that my favorite Southern ingredient is Carolina gold rice.
Ah, mhm.
It is incredible.
Nice. And you use that what would you use Carolina Gold Rice in?
Anything.
Oh,
At
okay.
the restaurant, we use it in our purloo, which is a rice-based seafood dish. You know, at home, I use it every time I make rice. It's just like such a good rice. It's nutty, it's got a great chew. It cooks in a way where every single grain is singular, like it falls apart, it's not stuck together. So unless I'm cooking basmati rice because I'm
Mhm,
making like maybe Persian or like Indian food that I just really want that aromatic quality and texture,
mhm.
I go with Carolina Gold rice, and I love rice. It's definitely my favorite grain, and
Oh,
and so not a week goes by where we don't have rice. It's like it's just comfort food. It's soul food, you know.
yeah.
But what's amazing about Carolina Gold rice, though, is how dynamic it is. You can get the Midlands, which are basically when they mill the rice, all the little broken pieces, you know, whether it's just a tip or it's just a rice grain broken half, etc.
Mhm.
Those are called the Midlands. You can take that and cook it up like risotto. So I'll
Oh,
use Carolina Gold rice sans arborio for my risottos. You can make rice balls with it, you know, arancinis. I mean, the list goes on. It's a really resilient, dynamic rice grain. And it also tells the story of foodways and culture to the South as it was brought from West Africa along with West African slaves and planted here, and it became a way of life for a lot of people and it became an industry. I mean, I think there was an entire century where slavery was bustling and profitable because of the planting and the harvesting of Carolina gold rice, you know, which is very unfortunate. But you know what happened was a cuisine evolved because of that.
right, and I think you touched a little bit upon that in some of the coursework, or some of the videos for your course. Your Scoolinary course called Southern
Hmm.
Cuisine, as I mentioned, features some Southern classics. You just spoke about Carolina gold rice and its history, which is really interesting because it does have a rich, deep, and maybe a little checkered history. I was wondering if you could explain the history behind one or two of the dishes from your course.
Yeah. Okay, so here's what I was thinking I could do. So I have a low country jambalaya, which is a seafood and rice based dish. Now, I elected to call it a jambalaya because of the international audience, and I wanted folks to see a word that they were familiar with because
Mm,
jambalaya is kind of globally famous. I think a lot of New Orleans foods are like gumbos, but at its core, it's actually a purloo. And so I'm kind of trying to do two things at once here, and I'm gonna tell you about that dish at its core by reading a head note about it that my wife and I wrote in the cookbook. So this
stage
will
is
give you a
yours.
little
Go
bit
ahead.
more insight on all of this, okay? Purloo is a one-pot rice-based dish with complex origins and etymology that can be traced back to Persia. Its preparation methods share similarities with many other treasured rice dishes found in regions where rice farming has historically provided a way of life. However, it was enslaved Africans who introduced it to the South in the form that we know and celebrate today. Low Country Purloo, a characteristic dish of the Carolina Rice Kitchen, bears a striking resemblance to West African jollof. The Carolina Rice Kitchen emerged in the early 19th century amongst enslaved Africans who cultivated and cooked Carolina gold rice. This legacy is one of sustainability, community, creativity, and a dependence on a complex agricultural system suited to local conditions and cultural needs. It is not a physical place, but a unique cuisine that reflects a melting pot of cultures and embodies the history of the region. The essential element of purloo is delicate, non-aromatic, long grain rice cooked in rich broth and layered with a variety of aromatics, tomatoes, meats, poultry, and seafood. The rice grains must be cooked to nearly dry with no residual liquid and must remain separate. Our recipe offers a unique take on the classic while highlighting the rich cultural history behind the dish. We combine savory seafood and the holy trinity of onion, celery, and pepper with accents from around the Mediterranean to create a purlieu that is elegant enough for any special occasion, yet comforting enough to be enjoyed family style at your next Sunday supper. And I think that that kind of sums up a lot about how I think of cooking, how I like to present Southern food, and how important I think storytelling is within the Southern cuisine framework.
Wow, that was incredible. And so, for listeners, if they want to know more about the book, or they want to purchase, or they can pre-order, what do they do?
I've got a link to pre-order purchases on my website. It's available for pre-order anywhere that it's being sold right now. Obviously, Amazon, I think Target and Barnes and Noble as well. And then we are fortunate enough to have a couple of really rad national retailers picking it up as well, like Williams Sonoma and Anthropology. So it's hopefully gonna, be easy to get your hands on come June 25th.
All right. So we've already gone through a little bit of your own history, and you've almost quite literally embraced soul food because you have it tattooed on your fingers. Soul
Yes.
food. How do you think cooking with intention or cooking with soul affects the flavor of food?
It's so important. We have to remember that we love the act of cooking as cooks, not even as chefs. As cooks, we have to remember that we're cooking because we love the act of cooking and we love the act of feeding. And when we do that, we make sure that our food is taken care of. There's a French term, soigner,
Hmm.
and if and I've worked for French chefs, and if a French chef, it's the greatest compliment you can get that a French chef would taste your food and say soigner. But soigner, it translates meaning to take care of, and it's a term that can be used in other applications. I mean, you could use it for suturing a wound, take care of it properly. And so it's not limited to culinary. And my interpretation of that is that you don't achieve that through just raw technical skills. You achieve that through like next level connection with your food,
Huh.
respecting the ingredients and putting your love and your soul and your focus in that food and wanting it to be as delicious as possible. And I think it's just doesn't matter what kind of food you cook. Every culture has soul food. That's why soul food is so good. If I'm in LA, just a random thing, but if I'm in LA and I go to a family like a mom and pop Asian restaurant in a strip mall up in the valley, I know it's going to be delicious because it's family run and they're making soul food. They're making their soul food.
Nice. If people want to follow your lead, whether it's in the kitchen or in the halls of government, how would you recommend that they do that?
Just go down the rabbit hole, find something that's interesting and try to learn as much about it as you can within the food space. Embrace it, absorb it into your practices and just see where that takes you. I started with trying to stop Pebble Mine in Bristol Bay. It wasn't this planned shift. I think a tangible thing I tell people to do is like try to buy better eggs. There's a lot
Hmm.
of things about sustainability that people are like, well, I can't afford that. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing, but most people buy a dozen eggs a week and maybe they spend like $1.99 on it or $2.99 on it. And you could probably afford to spend $3 more and get like some quality pasture raised eggs for $6 and support a completely different system of chicken egg production
Hmm.
for
Yeah.
$3 more. And also you're going to notice they taste better and they have more nutrients in them.
Wow, that's a really nice tip.
That might inspire you to try getting something else, and it doesn't have to be like certified organic, like I get my Carolina Gold rice from Marsh Hen Mill. It's a local farm 1 island over from me in the Carolinas. It's not certified organic. I don't need the USDA to tell me this is sustainable food. I know it is.
Huh, that's great advice. Start small. Something with
Yeah.
not a huge investment, and that can be a small change leading to a big change.
Yeah, take your time with it and find what matters to you.
Yeah. So, Sammy, you come into contact with a lot of people. I mean, you've mentioned that earlier in this chat that you were building relationships and friendships all across the United States with chefs, your peers. If you had to pick one or two or three people for a future episode of this podcast, who would they be?
Well, I always for starters, Andrew Zimmern is incredible. Have you talked to him yet?
Not yet.
He's incredible, and I'm sure he'd love to talk to you. And another chef that comes to mind specifically because he's a really good friend of mine. He lives in North Carolina. He's got a fantastic restaurant named The Marketplace. His name is William Disson. He was one of the chefs that was in the room. I think there was like three big gatherings that were put together by Paul Noonan at the Chef's Manifesto,
Sure.
and one
Mm-hmm.
was in New York. And
Hmm.
it was what led to become the Chef's Manifesto. And the one in New York, I believe, it was either in New York or in London, but William Disson was in the room and a part of the conversations early on that sparked the Chef's Manifesto.
Huh. Okay.
And he's somebody, every time I talk to him, it ends up being an hour and we're talking about food systems, talking about sustainability. He's a great mind to pick, really intelligent person.
Right, and I forgot to mention before the Chef's Manifesto is a partner of Scoolinary, so thank you for the mention as well.
Yeah.
So, well,
Yeah,
cool.
well, that's what brought us together
Yeah.
was the Chef's Manifesto partnership.
Hmm.
And then have you talked to Mary Sue Milliken yet?
Yes.
Okay, I thought so.
Yes. That was exciting for me,
She's
as is
incredible.
this. So, hey, Sammy, I want to thank you for your time and answering some of the questions that I had and talking to us a little bit. I hope you make your 5 more days without coffee. You can do it. And I hope we get a chance to talk to you again sometime.
Yeah, please stay in touch, Wendy. This was probably the best podcast I've ever done. No diss to the other ones I've done, but I just really love your style, the
Ah,
questions, and how it all layered together. I think it just felt so meaningful and worthwhile to try to put this energy out there and see if maybe some people do something in their own way with it.
well, very good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you like this episode, don't miss an episode by becoming a member. We're waiting for you each week with more guests. We're on all podcast platforms. Just search for Coffee with Scoolinary. We're also waiting for you at our website and on our social networks, where you can get to know all our courses and teachers.